Hey everyone, how's it going? Well, it's been a little while since I made a proper video. I did post one video 3 weeks ago, but that was just some footage that I took on a walk that I took just outside my apartment, so it wasn't really a proper booktube video. So it's really been 4 weeks since I made an actual booktube video. And that's just because I've been very busy. I co-taught a 4-week summer class, so it's 15 weeks of content squeezed into 4 weeks, and I taught half of the 4 weeks. So the time I was teaching was not very long, but it was very intense and took a lot of prep. So I have just been, barely keeping my head above water for the past few weeks. But I have been reading, and that's great, but I'm also now done with all that. I finished my grading up, and the class has been taken over by my co-instructor, so I can leave it up to him now. And so I thought that now that I'm free, I would get back into making booktube videos by making a Friday Reads. So first off, in kind of homage to my old Sunday miscellany videos that I made for a while on my channel, where I talked about not only what I was reading, but also music that I listened to and movies that I watched, I thought that I would start by leaving a playlist to a link to a Spotify playlist of a lot of the music that I have been listening to lately. And those of you who know my taste well will know that I'm very into classical music. And there is some classical music in the playlist, and I have been listening to classical music. And some of the new pieces I've listened to have been quite superb, but actually lately I've been focusing much more on more modern music, on pop music, as I call it in scare quotes, because really when I say pop music, I just mean music that isn't classical music or jazz. So that includes punk rock, folk, pop, indie rock, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that in there, actually. And from a wide range, I like to think of genres and times. There's a Bob Dylan song in there. There's a song by Low from an album that came out in the 1990s. There's a song that came out, I think, just a few weeks ago in this playlist. So there's quite a wide range of times, and there's a decent range of genres as well. There's a little bit of folk, a little bit of pop, a little bit of punk rock, some post-rock, some progressive rock, some proper just pop music as well. So there's a good mix in there. So I will leave a link to that Spotify playlist for you if you are interested. And I thought that I would also show off Bessie a little bit, because you probably haven't seen her in a long time, and I don't make a point of showing her off. Of course, she probably looks very happy right now that I'm holding her like this. But yeah, I know there were a lot of people out there who will be happy to see her, and now I will free her and let her go loose. So, now on to the books. As I said, I have been reading during these 3 weeks, even though I've been busy. I'm not going to talk about everything that I read over those 3 weeks, because that would just be a lot. I'm just going to talk about what I'm currently reading, like a normal Friday Reads, right? And so, first off, I will start with a novel that I have been reading. And that is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is a novel that I have wanted to read forever. I have wanted to read this for probably 6 years or so, and I'm just finally getting around to reading it. And it's one of those cases where you wait and you wait and you wait to read that book that's been on your TBR for so long, and then you finally get to it, and it's every bit worth the wait. This book is so good. It's so good. So what it's about, for those who don't know about The God of Small Things, it takes place in Kerala, which is a region in the southern part of India. And it's about this kind of upper middle class family there. And this family are actually Syrian Christians. Kerala is a province of India that's unique insofar as there's actually a pretty substantial percentage of the population who are Christian. And they're Syrian Christians. I'm not entirely certain why they're called Syrian Christians. I don't really know the history behind that. But they're a Christian family. And the story is about fraternal twins named Esta and Rahel. Esta is a boy, Rahel is a girl. And the novel takes place in the 1960s and 70s, I think. And it revolves primarily around the events of one single day in the lives of Esta and Rahel. And the tragic events of this day have huge ramifications for their lives. Basically, the events of this day ruin their lives, essentially. And I'm not going to say why, because that would be spoilers, and also I haven't necessarily found it all out, because I'm not finished with the book. But it's an interesting book in terms of its structure, because it basically takes place over the course of one day, essentially. It focuses on the events of that one day, that one tragic day. But it also flips back and forth between events that happened before that day, when Esta and Rahel were younger, and also events that happen in the present, so-called, when they're in their 30s. The novel sort of, it's implied that it's from the perspective of when the two of them are in their early 30s, remembering this day. But so the narration flips between different points in their lives, but focuses on that one day. So even though it takes place over the course of one day, obviously, given the length of the book, there's a lot of other stuff packed into it. And I'm finding that disjointed structure with stories coming from different points in time is really interesting. It was a little bit disorienting at first, because it's not always stated explicitly which point in time you're getting a certain anecdote from. But what I found is that you can usually pick it up pretty quickly based on little details in either details about the age of Esta or Rahel, or something about what's going on around them. And I'm finding that structure really works for me. And this is probably only one of a handful of novels that I've read where the entire novel only takes place over the course of one day. But I'm finding that I really find that structure really fascinating. The novel that takes place over the course of only one day, yet somehow also feels like it encompasses a lot. And you know, other examples probably would be Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, Ulysses by James Joyce, Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin is told over the course of a single day. And I'm finding that each one does that in a slightly different way, but each is pretty cool in its own form. But I'm loving the book, and I'm finding the structure fascinating, but also just the writing is absolutely fantastic. The simplest images you can imagine are just described absolutely beautifully. And maybe I'll read one just very small little passage to you. It's a very short passage, but it demonstrates just the beauty of the imagery in The God of Small Things. And this image doesn't even really have anything to do with the story. I mean, you can see some symbolic resonances with the story, but the image itself isn't even related that closely to what's going on. It's just so beautiful. So I'll read it. It's a very short passage. A white boat spider floated up with the river in the boat, struggled briefly, and drowned. Her white egg sac ruptured prematurely, and 100 baby spiders, too light to drown, too small to swim, stippled the smooth surface of the green water before being swept out to sea. I mean, it's just beautiful. Like, you can point to certain aspects of the sentence there. I was noticing it as I read it, all the S words in that second half of the sentence. Also with some B's in there as well. And just that image of the egg sac rupturing and all these baby spiders helplessly kind of drifting on the water. It's just beautiful, I think. And the book is filled with imagery like that. And that's primarily why I'm loving it. But also, there's a large cast of characters in this book. It's not a long book. Again, it's about one family, but there's a rather large cast of characters, given that it is only about one family. And they really all just leap off the page. They're all so interesting and well drawn. Even the ones who don't necessarily have a lot of lines or aren't super central to the story feel very real and well characterized with very little screen time, so to speak. And I have this theory about authors of fiction. I have this theory that authors of fiction, in their approach to portraying characters, are either Dickensian or they're Tolstoy-influenced, Tolstoy-esque, I don't know. either they're Charles Dickens influenced or they're Leo Tolstoy influenced. And I think the Charles Dickens writers tend to describe characters in long, detailed passages about them, and so you get the idea of who a character is because the author is kind of describing them to you. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, Charles Dickens was great at just describing a character and bringing them to life in a long passage. But what Tolstoy did, Tolstoy was almost the opposite. He was almost minimalist in the way that he created characters. You could explore characters with a lot of depth in Tolstoy, but then you would also get characters where you only need to see them for maybe one scene or hear about them for a couple of sentences before you got the sense of who they were. And that was more what Tolstoy was. He was more minimalist, but he did a lot with what little he put on the page about characters. And I get the sense that Arundhati Roy leans in more towards the Tolstoy side than the Dickens side, even though there are some elements of the story that to me actually feel a little bit Dickensian. But anyway, I just love the way that she characterizes the people in the story. I'm finding fascinating learning about the sort of socio-political history of India in the period that it takes place. Again, I think it's the 1960s and 70s, but there's a lot about casteism and the caste system and the effects that it's had on people's lives. The family of Esther and Rahel are pretty high caste. I don't know specifically what caste they are, but then you also see characters who are untouchables, who are sort of outside the caste system and are ostracized, and often very poor and poorly educated and such, and that's quite fascinating. I'm just really loving it on the whole. So yeah, great read. I'm loving it. I should finish it this weekend. So either I don't know if I'll wrap it up in a Friday Reads next week. I'm not sure what will happen with videos that I'm making this summer, but I'm really loving it. I can't imagine not end up loving it when I finish it. So The God of Small Things. Let me know if you've read it. I'd be curious to hear from people who've read it, who liked it. I know it's kind of a love or hate book, it seems, which I didn't know until I started reading Goodreads reviews of it, and seeing that there were people giving it 1 star, and people giving it 5 stars, and someone else giving it 2 stars, and someone else bailing on it, and then other people giving it 4 and 5 stars. It seems like a love or hate book, and I'm clearly of the love camp. So anyway, that's the novel that I'm working on. I am also reading a biography at the moment. Now, some of you may recall that I am challenging myself to read only fiction in the year of 2022. However, one of the exceptions to that rule is that I can buddy read nonfiction books. And so I am buddy reading Henry David Thoreau, A Life by Laura Dassow Walls, and I'm buddy reading it with Patrice Jones. She and I haven't done a buddy read in some time. But this is obviously a biography of Henry David Thoreau, whose work I have now explored with some depth. I have read Walden, and I have read the collected essays and poems of Thoreau that the Library of America puts out. And those, incidentally, were also both buddy reads with Sharon Goforth, but anyway, that's beside the point. I've read quite a lot of Thoreau's work, a lot of his major essays, his major book, Walden, and some of his poetry. And his poetry isn't that good, so I don't really care about it. But his essays are very interesting. Walden's very interesting. And so it's very interesting coming to this biography, knowing a fair amount about his work and his thinking and his style and such. And this biography is so good. It's so eloquent. It's one of the first biographies that I've read, and I haven't read a ton of biographies, but one of the first biographies I've read where I feel like I can say that the writing in the biography is almost as good as the writing that the writer did. Because Laura Dassow Walls she knows how to turn a phrase, she knows how to describe, she knows how to convey ideas beautifully. She's great, she's awesome, and her research is clearly really sharp. And Patrice and I are both just adoring this biography. And what's great about good biographies is that they're not only portraits of the people, they're also portraits of the time. And I think that that's accentuated when it comes to Thoreau, because he did write so much about current events and the social and political issues of his time, that this book is also very much a portrait of America in the first half of the 19th century. Because you learn about the way that abolitionism was discussed, the Mexican War, and government encroachment, the rise of larger government, and so on. You learn all of this stuff about the time that Thoreau was writing about. But by extension, by learning about the United States in the first half of the 19th century, you also learn about America today, really, because something that becomes clear, I feel like the more you read about American history, is that really there's very little that's new under the sun. We're still, in large part, having the same arguments and discussions and controversies and atrocities now as we did then, which is a little bit depressing. On some level, it's maybe a little bit comforting just to know that the awful things happening now aren't necessarily super unique. But anyway, this is just a great read. I don't have much I can say about specific aspects of it, because if I started to talk about specifics, I would go on for another half hour about what Thoreau thought about various issues. But it's just a great book, and we're about halfway through it. Probably going to finish it in a couple weeks at least. So that is great if you're interested in Thoreau. I think I can already recommend this, even though I haven't finished it. But yeah, just a great read. Okay, so my last book is a bit of an odd one. So my last book that I want to talk about is The Complete Poems by William Blake. And this is edited by Alicia Ostriker. And so this is, well, the complete poems of the English poet William Blake. And this is an author who has been something of a white whale for me. William Blake has always sort of stood on a hill for me as an author who I was always pretty sure I was going to love, but who I was just profoundly intimidated by. He is an intimidating author, and I think that reputation for being intimidating is earned in his case. A lot of his poetry is not easy. Outside of the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. If you're talking about the Songs of Innocence and of Experience, those are relatively straightforward, although I think that there are subtleties in them that maybe aren't appreciated on a surface reading, but those are relatively easy to read. And I love the Songs of Innocence and of Experience. But when you start getting into his more mystical poetry, his sort of mythopoeic poems, for those who don't know Blake well, he had this whole mythical system, sort of mythological history of the universe that he came up with. And he wrote about this sort of mytho-history of the world through this invented mythology. And literally, I mean a mythology. I don't mean it is philosophical, but I don't mean that in a philosophical way. I mean literally in this mythological system, the way that the world was created was that there was this one primordial man named Albion who fell at one point and split into 4 Zoas, as they're called, who are basically gods. And the conflict between the 4 Zoas and their emanations, as they're called, caused basically the creation of the universe and the inception of human history. And so when I say mythology, I literally mean like gods and quote-unquote goddesses, having conflicts and arguing with each other and so on. And so he has this whole system worked out, and the system itself isn't always consistent, and so there's that aspect. There's all these names to learn, and there's this whole history to learn, and there are different versions of the history that he writes about, and that is intimidating. But then on top of that, he can often write about that mythological history in a very obtuse way. It can often be easy to lose track of what's going on in a William Blake poem, even the narrative poems. It can just be difficult to keep track of who's talking or what someone is saying or what's going on. And I just am so thankful that this volume has really great endnotes by Alicia Ostriker. It has a lot of endnotes that explain what's going on and often explain kind of the symbolism, but also sometimes just point out who's talking, what's happening, just to keep things clear. And so you can see that I have a bookmark for where I am and a mark for where I am in the notes so that I can follow along with those, because they are essential to getting what's going on in William Blake's more epic poems. But I have to say that it is all worth it for me. I am loving Blake. Not only is there a lot of just powerful language in his poems, really quotable lines, really powerful passages, he was also a fascinating thinker for the time that he lived in. Actually, his ideas about, especially institutionalized religion, strike me as actually very Nietzschean, very similar to Friedrich Nietzsche, because he was very critical of institutionalized religion, of religion that was based on rigid adherence to moral laws, basically. He, in that way, was very mystical, and he himself was very religious, actually, but he just had a profound distrust, it seems, of institutionalized religion. And it's interesting just seeing those ideas in an author who lived in the second half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. I associate ideas like that more with the later 19th century, especially after The Origin of Species was published. But he had these ideas before The Origin of Species came out. And so I'm finding that all just really cool. And I am chipping away at that. I'm not reading it quickly. It's sort of my back burner book. I'm currently making my way through Vala, or the Four Zoas, which was his first attempt at a real big epic where he went through his whole mythological history of the world. And that is quite fascinating. So anyway, that's the third book I'm reading, and that is everything that I'm reading. So anyway, you all let me know how you're doing, and let me know what you're reading, and if you've read anything that I have mentioned, then, let me know what you think of it. We can talk about it in the comments. And anyway, I will try to check back in next week with another Friday Reads. We'll see how it goes. This summer is going to be kind of jam-packed. I am supposed to propose my dissertation on August 3rd, and I don't have a single word written, so that's going to occupy most of my summer. And maybe I'll keep you all updated with how that's going. But anyway, I will stop talking there. Again, let me know what you're reading, what you're doing this weekend, and if you have any thoughts on the books that I've talked about. But anyway, I will end it there. Talk to you all later.